Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. We're on the home front for this episode of the podcast. The expansion of British industry to cater for war production began to be put into place in the 1930s. But still, with the outbreak of war, Britain needed to stretch every sinew to harness, coordinate and maximise its resources. Firstly to defend itself and then to help liberate Axis-occupied countries. In this episode, I'm talking to Neil Storey. Neil is an award-winning social historian and lecturer, specialising in the impact of war on 20th-century society, and his new book is Wartime Industry. Neil, thanks for joining me. So, I thought I would start by taking us back to the First World War. When Britain went to war in 1914, the government's response to the economy was business as usual. But by 1916, the state had encroached on every aspect of industry and manpower to control production. Now, I wonder if those lessons had been learned from the First World War and plans put into place during the interwar years for if the country ever went to war again.
After the First World War, it was a great feeling that there should never be another war like the First World War. There was talk in Parliament of hard-faced businessmen sitting in Parliament who've done rather well during the Great War. So they put in place from 1919 this idea of a 10-year rule, where they say, no, there's not going to be any war in Europe for 10 years. And under the Geddes Acts of Eric Geddes, they said, look, no, we're not just going to stop spending, we're going to cut back on the spending. So yes, they re-established the territorial forces, the territorial army, but the army was certainly not being desperately modernized. The Navy was having to get by on the vessels as it had in the First World War. But many people were still saying, we're not going to have another war. This was the Great War for civilization.
But does the government sort of at any point, at what point does it start thinking about there might be another war? Do we need to think about a war economy? What can we do? Is there anything we could do when we're not at war to prepare for war? Do they have plans, so in 1939 they could pull off, plan B, back factories, here we go. Or is that not in place?
Oh yes. I mean, by 39, when we get to 30, there's rumblings around in the Far East. They don't like the expansion of some of the Far Eastern armies and the machinations over there. So that the world starts to get uncomfortable about that. The rise of the Nazis, although there's a lot of talk about appeasement, when Goering starts talking about the expansion of the German Air Force that would ultimately become the Luftwaffe, he's talking about mega factories that can super produce hundreds of planes every month, and it frightens the world, and particularly when we see the bombing of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. That shocked the world. That was German Air Force. They're dropping incendiary bombs, high explosive bombs, lots of death. As in the First World War, we had never seen a modern all big gun warfare. The technology of war is advancing at a frightening pace. It could come to our door. So really from 1935 under the Baldwin government, Baldwin saying, yeah, okay, we're going to increase the number of squadrons. He doesn't desperately put in a lot of plans to increase the number of aircraft. But luckily, the Secretary of State, Lord Swinton, it gets together with Sir Herbert Austin, and they kind of say, well, why don't we expand a bit? Because we've still got notable aircraft manufacturers that have been around since World War I. But since the Great War, we hadn't needed an awful lot of aircraft. So they had been reduced down. The skills base had been reduced down. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to build these things called shadow factories. Now, that might sound rather sinister, but it's not. The idea of the original shadow factories in the mid-1930s were that they would be built in the shadow of extant, mostly motor car factories and aircraft factories, built in the shadow, and in that shadow, the technology and the knowledge of the people there would learn from each other, expand. The government paid huge amounts of money for the land nearby, for the buildings nearby, for the staff that included not just on the shop floor, but admin staff. The whole works of the shadow factories were financed by the government. So it's a vast, vast scheme. By the time we get to 1939, you've got Austin, Daimler, Roots, Rover, Standard, and Bristol Aeroplane. In fact, there's 12 shadow factories in total in September 1939.
Are they quite specific what they're producing, or are they kind of almost like generic factories that could turn their hands to anything they needed? If they needed wings, they could make wings. If they just retooled the lathes, or are they quite specific? If they're built next to a car factory, they're doing motor vehicles.
Well, if it's in the main, it's for aircraft production, but it depends on the size of the because it soon starts expanding when war breaks out to other factories that could turn their hands to the production. So these originals, they would probably make the majority of an engine, for example, or they would build airframes. Some did the whole works, but some of the aircraft companies didn't want them having all of that knowledge. So they would get as far as they could, but the final bits, By the time we get to World War II, there are hundreds of these factories. In fact, here's a statistic. I don't know this off the top of my head. I'm gonna read it to you, but it's January 1943. The stats return. This was the height of shadow factories and production for aircraft in wartime. There were 473 establishments making parts for aircraft. And that's establishments that have over 100 employees. There were smaller ones too. But you see, during the war, Arthur Askey, he sang a song about the thingamy-bob. And she's the girl that cranks the thing, that oils the ring, So all these different processes that makes the thingamy-bob that's going to win the war. And what he said was absolutely right, that some of these factories and where people were working, particularly the smaller ones, people would make a part for an aircraft engine. It would be dedicated to just that part or a piece of technology for an aircraft all the way through the war, and they wouldn't always know what it was for until after the end of the war. Isn't that crazy?
Who's kind of the puppet master for these shadow factories? How do they organise the contracts to say, you make that, but because it's so specialised, when you're breaking it out to people doing very specialised parts like that, it must be a very intricate command and control that's making sure that there's somebody doing something in the right numbers to get the thingamabob to that factory to do this, that and the other. Is it private industry or is it government controlled? Or
One man. You see, until 1939, under Swinton, there had been, here's a lovely phrase for you, vacillation of purpose. A bit of procrastination, and really things were not going at the speed of production they should have done. And in fact, some of the comments of the opposition by people like Michael Foote and other critiques of the sort of men that went really too far in the appeasement of Hitler, criticised in 39, things did need to change. There were changes, but one man changed it. After Churchill was appointed Prime Minister, he knew this war, it's going to be fought on land, sea, and in the air. But one of the key things is we need to increase our aircraft production. So he looked at a press baron, a man that he knew by the name of Max Aitken, who ran one of the biggest sort of newspaper kingdoms in the world. He's a press baron known as Lord Beaverbrook, known to the people of Great Britain as the Beaver. And what the Beaver wanted, the Beaver got. And he had the drive. He didn't make himself popular, but my God, he produced aircraft. And he was the man. He made sure that not only did he control supplies, and if a factory required supplies, He had the control to divert them if they were going to somewhere else and the other factory was more in need. He had the inspectorate under his command. He was absolutely the hub of aircraft production. And no matter what anybody can say about him, the man delivered.
I love the term shadow factory. Were they kept a secret? Was the were the Germans aware that there was this kind of network of I don't know, what are they, sub factories?
Well, the shadow factory network. I mean, it existed in. It's rather ironic. In the late 1930s, there were a number of quite high-profile spy trials in Great Britain where Germans were captured for spying, for doing things like sketching British airfields. Yeah, sure enough, they were spying. But underneath this air league, this sort of international air league, we could go and see Germany, they could come and see us. And in 1937, in effect, Goering's deputy, Erhard Milch of the Luftwaffe, who was actually a lot more savvy than Goering, he was actually shown round one of the aircraft producing shadow factories with his entire entourage, taking lots of photographs, saying, "Oh, boys, you've come a long way since last year." You couldn't write this stuff, could you? You couldn't make it up.
It's international diplomacy at its best. Now, I made a note that there's something incredible, like 1.8 million people employed in aircraft production. Is that currently, or I mean, it's just an absolutely astronomical number? But then it got me thinking about the Royal Navy. Of course, is the senior service, and we have the biggest navy in the world, and
the finest navy in the world, says he in a very biased way. Britannia ruled the waves. Is that really true?
Well, it got me thinking back to that again, that turn of the century where we just wanted to build warships. We want 8, we won't wait when it came to dreadnoughts. What do we? If you've got 1.8 million people producing aircraft, who's left to produce anything for the Royal Navy? Or did we carry on producing ships in Britain at a great pace?
It's a really good point, Angus. The point was, in the interwar years, that the 10-year rule also applied to the shipyards. And some shipyards were in danger of closing down. If you don't have the Navy building ships, you don't need vast numbers of merchant vessels. So when we get to the latter part of the 30s and the outbreak of war, all of a sudden we're needing ships. So we mustn't forget, it's not just battleships of war to do the fighting, but with the losses caused by the U-boat campaign off Great Britain. People often say, oh, it was the phony war between 1939 and May 1940. You tell that to any man in the merchant or Royal Navy, right? That's a very, very different story out there, ladies and gentlemen, because you're not just fighting the U-boat menace. The Luftwaffe are dive bombing you. You're also having to deal with mines, and there are minesweepers, incredibly brave lads of Harry Tate's Navy. So we've got to replace those vessels so we can keep our supplies running and also fight a war. So then they go to the shipyards, say, we need you. But by that time, the war had kind of started. So a lot of the men who'd been out of work, all that skills base that had been, guys had been out of work for a few years. All that skills base, they thought, oh, we'll go and join up. We'll join the Navy. We'll go and join the Army. It's not a matter of being a war reserved occupation. You were out of work in 39. The minute you get a chance at some work, off you go. In 1939, under what they nicknamed the Militia Act, it's really the first act of conscription. If you're aged between 18 and 21, they say, all right, lads, we're going to need to give you 6 months military training. And once you finish that, that's all right, go back to Civvy Street, but you'll be on a war reserve. Now, that's in the middle of 1939. Most of these lads had not finished their training. Yes, great, in the military. Trouble is, they're all the lads that be the young, keen apprentices joined the shipyards. So, from that wonderful cohort of young men. So it was really nose to the grindstone. Lots of the old boys came back into the shipyards. But you see, if you haven't worked in that environment for a number of years, it's not just your knowledge that can fade a little bit, but your physique after years of that can soon fall by the wayside. So you got these very young lads, 14, 15 years old, very old boys, but you've also got the ladies coming in. And now that was a big step. It was very hard for women to be accepted by some of these old boys in the shipyard. But these girls, they went to colleges, they learned welding, they're rivet catchers, they're riveteurs. And my God, they worked. So hats off to the ladies on the shipyards, that's for sure.
So when they introduce conscription, is it a blanket conscription? My assumption was that when, like in the First World War, that there's a whole raft of exemptions almost instantly come out. So men, they just go shipyards. You're not going. If you're under this age, that age, you don't need to go. Did they not do that during the Second World War? I presume they were more sophisticated rather than blanket conscription. I've never looked at it before. Who goes and who doesn't go?
Yeah, well, again, it's a really, really good point that if you say you've worked in a shipyard or, you've got your experienced labourer, 5-6 years, you know your way around, even longer than 10 years. But if you get chopped, if you get, we made redundant, lads, we don't need you, we're closing the shipyards. Remember, there was the Jarrow March. They're shutting these places down. There's no protection for you, and why should these boys have gone and found work elsewhere, so they're not in if you're not employed in that field, they can't hammer it into you. If you are, for example, a miner, or you're still working in a shipyard, but they're now saying, right, it's conscription, we're needing men in factories, you could transfer to one of the new engineering factories, somewhere that's a little less dangerous or cold and grimy and horrible than a shipyard. So within the war reserved occupations, you could transfer. So you end up losing men like that as well.
Okay. You mentioned miners there. Presumably mining is a bit of a... Was that on a similar footing?
Yeah, absolutely. Mines had closed in the interwar years. Bitingly hard poverty for some of those lads working down there. In the Second War, there were no women working down the mines. They just didn't feel it just didn't happen. So the idea was get the young lads in. So people often will talk about the Bevan boys, rightly, but it should not be forgotten that there were lads aged 13, 14 years old going under their own volition to their local mines, training and starting work down the mines at that age too. It was only later in the war, Bevan said, look, we're getting really short. And there was this sort of story that the mines were getting really short of coal being excavated. It's dangerously low supplies. We need to up this. So then they brought in the sort of lottery system where a certain number of men under the cohort of conscription would be designated to work down mines. Hence, because Bevan had brought it in, they became known as Bevan boys.
My dad's best pal was a Bevan boy. And my mum said of all my dad's mates who went to the war, they were all perfectly happy to talk about the war, apart from, I've forgotten his name, apart from my dad's best pal who went down the mines, who refused to talk about it. He absolutely hated it, his war, serving down the mines. But the rest of it, and this chap's brother, Arthur, he was sank twice. And he was a bit like Uncle Arthur on Only Fools Horses. And Arthur would bore you senses, but he loved it, and my uncle loved it. But John, he was called, John Coverdale, he refused to talk about his war. He just hated being sent down the mines as a Bevan boy.
I know. I've heard of guys, that well-educated guys, and that doesn't mean just going to universities or colleges, well-educated local guys that could have made a contribution to other forces, end up down mines. And, other men that could have been, it doesn't always have to be good educated, men that would have made good soldiers that ended up down the mine. But, it had to happen. If that was your number, that's your job. Away you go, boys.
Yeah, I hadn't quite realised it was just as simple as a lottery system. I sort of assumed there was some, it's easy to assume there's some sort of sorting goes out magically somewhere, but I guess it's fair. It was probably not seen as a glorious thing either, having to go down the mines.
No, it wasn't. And the boys that worked down there were often, there's a certain amount of resentment by the men that have worked and the lads that have been down there since, day one, that these are incomers. These are not necessarily local guys. These are guys sent to the area. so that they'll speak differently. They will be, to the men that know what they're doing down there and are experienced down there, sometimes they weren't as helpful as they might be, in the same way that some of the people on the shipyards didn't like the women coming in. It happens. It's like the new kids in school stuff, but ultimately, and it's, people talk about the myth of the Blitz spirit. Well, the point is, if people didn't pull together, number one, that's poor moral. That's poor for morale. There were laws brought in against that, particularly if you were speaking badly about how the war is going. You could wind up in court. And if you deliberately don't help people, or even do things like hiding their tools up and stuff, if you got caught doing that, you'd get the manager would be saying, right, that's sabotage. And you get caught again, and you will go to court. And that's a pretty hefty sentence if you are sabotaging the war effort. You could go to the gallows for that, me old mucker. So pull together, otherwise you'll be in trouble.
I never thought of it that way. Because the other thing that just quickly ran through my head was that in areas that were heavy into things like coal mining, whereas other areas of the country will have all men will be in khaki or in uniform. In mining areas, men wouldn't have been. They'll all have been. If you see a man nowadays, probably there because he's from the pit. So actually seeing their men folk about was probably normal compared to other parts.
Yeah. From 1939, the boys that could have volunteered went, or they went into other war reserved occupations. But yeah, they'd be very young lads, old boys, or in those mid years, it's the Bevan boys coming in as well.
So you've alluded to women being women being conscripted. They're not conscripted from 39, though, are they? That takes some time before they introduced conscription.
That's right. Now we mustn't forget that there were women volunteering for British military services that were that they were all shut down after World War One. The late 30s, there's going to be no procrastination. The Wrens, Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, they were all recruiting from just before 1939, and away they went. That's brilliant. Plenty of volunteers. In industry, there were women coming in from 1939. We must make no mistake about that. They say otherwise the country would have ground to a halt. But from 1942, when it's late 41, when the Act is passed, 42, it's the first full year of the introduction of one of the later conscription acts, or the clause to the Act that brings women in. And that could be, you could serve in the military, you could serve in the land army, or you could serve in factories.
What was the criteria? Is there an age span they're conscripted women from? Is every woman eligible for conscription?
I'd like to add in there was also, you could join some of the civil defence services as well. So we mustn't forget those guys. Mustn't forget that my granny was an ambulance driver. but the age is around about 17 if you're going to let you in, 18 for definite conscription. And then it will go up to 45, but then they up the age as well a little bit during the war years. But yet again, if you were an older woman and you wanted to work, you could volunteer. And with so many men going away to war, older women, maybe not fit enough to work in factories, although a lot of women could do, and they also worked in factories. But in addition to that, they also looked after their neighbours' children. And there were what they call evacuation nurseries and nurseries set up for war workers. Some war worker women, you got her husband's gone away to war, she wants to go and work in munitions. They put the kids into foster care. I kid you not.
It's commitment to the war. It's people, full scale consent for what's going on around them. Could these women, when they're conscripted, were they just lotteried into arms, or is it by sector? Could they choose their sector? Sorry, that they're going into.
Yes, you could a little bit. A little bit more flexible. If you really, they always wanted the priority was towards the support for the military services. Again, I think most people realise that they were not armed, but the idea was free a man for the front. So just about every other job apart from carrying a weapon in action could be done by a member of the female services. But if you didn't want to do that, they'd sort of say, well, try the factory, or then it'd be civil defence. And then if you really wanted to go for the land army, go for the land army. They're all valid, but they would try and guide you towards war production or the military. That would be the priority.
I mean, the poster girl, obviously, for women at war is that American Rosie the Riveter. Do we ever... I was trying to think if there's a British equivalent of Rosie the Riveter that's as well known, and it might be it was well known at the time, but not well known now. And I can't. Was the one I can't think of one.
There is one iconic image that I think is just as powerful as Rosie the Riveter, which is the Zec poster that says women come into the factories, and she's got her arms raised and you can see the aircraft above. It's sort of a brown colour to it, but she's really strong. So she sadly doesn't have a name, but the Philip Zec image is just as iconic.
Yeah, you're right. It is the factory and the chimneys behind her, the bombers flying over her head, and there's some tanks just to the bottom. Yes, of course it is. It's just that no advertising executive gave her a name.
That's the trouble. And Rosie is, you could connect that to, I think at one time there was more than one woman that claimed to be Rosie the Riveter. And of course, she's more human. She's pretty, she's strong, she's a real symbol of getting your hands dirty, but still remaining feminine. But that in great strength that she's showing there, that's powerful. That's powerful. That's a role model for women to really latch onto, rather than just an iconic symbol of women coming to the factories.
Interesting stuff. Now, as we're getting away from war production, I was going to drag us back to the challenges of ramping up industry, because something else we've been discussing, conscription. And you see those quite iconic photographs of the Home Guard with no guns, no uniforms, on parade. Thinking about that and reading the book, it suddenly occurred to me that we probably had literally millions of uniforms, and then in 1937 we changed the pattern, which is probably great because it's probably a more usable pattern, but suddenly all that store of old uniforms probably was disposed of. So is there a problem with capacity to produce? We must have produced millions of uniforms.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the old ones, there's still lots of the old kit kicking around. If you look at the soldiers marching to Dunkirk, a lot of them almost could be marching to the First World War. They've got the side hats in, but they've still got the tunics with the brass buttons. They've tall puttees for some units as well. But the soldiers would remember that it wasn't long after they were in France, when they didn't have very good tailoring facilities quite often, that they were issued this new battle dress. And they really did feel that they were losing something in their old regiment by having to put their accoutrements, their shoulder titles and buttons into a box and wear something that you couldn't shine. But somebody had to be making this stuff. Now, luckily, and not a lot of people, you see, we've talked a little bit about the raw materials, but you've got to think, in the First World War, we were lucky. We were lucky we had the wool. We just couldn't get the dye very easily, because the biggest supplier of dyes, the khaki dye in the world, was Germany in 1914. And all of a sudden, they didn't like supplying us with dye anymore, so we had to up that. But at least we always had a good wool clip, and we had bought the wool clip from Australia, New Zealand, and away, and these are huge, vast quantities of wool. So we were very fortunate that they had that, and there was what they call the wool control set up in Great Britain, so that the factories that are producing The uniforms, of course, they get the main supply of wool. It might sound rather rivet countering, but let's face it, it gets the job done. And we are a nation of, in those days, of suit makers. The biggest in their day was Burton's, Montague Burton, and Burton's and their extant factories were more or less taken over entirely by 1939, 1940 for the production of military uniforms. And in total, a quarter of all uniforms, I mean, there's millions of them, are made by Burton's. The rest are just about any tailoring company you could possibly imagine, from workwear to suits to people that were making women's clothing, gown companies, anything like skirts, anything. They were all working on these huge government contracts.
I presume that's Burton. Montague Burton's is what in the 80s becomes Burton before it gets swallowed up by Topshop.
It was exactly the same thing, yeah. Absolutely. So they were going a long, long while.
They do change. They make adjustments to the uniform, don't they? The British battle dress during the war to save on wool.
Absolutely right. That's what they brought in. It was called the utility pattern. And it's just like the utility clothes. It was to make things go a bit further. So if you look at the 1937 pattern tunic, you've got pleats in the breast pockets of the jacket. Utility pattern, it's smooth. Rather than having a fly front on your jacket with brass buttons behind it, the brass, that's needed for gun shells now. And that's getting really tight supplies on brass. So they're using a sort of plastic or fibre-based button as well. And it's the same on the trousers. They're made in a more economic way. A lot of people don't realise that we had we were really strapped for leather, because leather came from abroad. A lot of our raw materials were imported. So we had a real problem with boot production. So there were huge efforts in factories for the reconditioning of army boots. So not just manufacture, but to recondition old boots and get them back out to the front.
I was quite surprised to hear that. I just assumed that British ammunition boots were a British product.
Well, we had good leather here, but it was the sheer supply of the stuff. We've got to get it from the States quite often, or in Argentina, South America. And as the U-boat war tightened in, we're an island. We can fit Britain into some of the states of America. So, we've got to really, really step it up. You think of raw materials like aluminium as well. What did we do? We're running short of it. We can't get all the gear in, import it all. So that's when the salvage drives kick in. Now, admittedly, the very first one was probably more of a patriotic effort to try and bring the country together, as all the railings were taken and decorations on houses, the sort of things, and the guns that had been captured in World War I went to smelt off and make German weapons. Well, a lot of that stuff, if we're really honest, it was kept on railway sidings and eventually was dumped out. It went out by the boatload from the Thames and was dumped. But it did a lot to bring the country together. And it certainly kept us well supplied with iron. But what about aluminium? Well, aluminium, the very first big recycling campaign was what they called salvage drives in World War II. So we got pots, pans, old kettles, people volunteering to give away hundreds, thousands of tons of aluminium that really was smelted down and really did do its bit for the war effort.
I'm sure there's a plaque when I was growing up somewhere, or it might be a Bakelite plaque, that the town had given enough aluminium to build a Spitfire or something. I'm sure there was some sort of drive like that was pointed out to me as a child. I wonder if it still exists.
Or it might have been the plastic plaques with the soldier on it. That was the Salute the Soldier week. And it might be one of those. They look like they were sort of a marble fixture, but actually it's plastic. And that's for Salute the Soldier in 1944. And that scheme was to get you to buy war bonds. So it meant that you went, if you had, say, a tenner in the bank, so you can spare a tenner, buy these war bonds, which means you kind of loan for the war effort, like buying national savings today. Then after the war, they pay you back.
Maybe that's what it was.
But there are all sorts of plaques, because even small groups of parishes had what they called Warship Week, where they would raise money for war bonds again, and they would adopt, even quite small areas, motor torpedo boats, and cities adopted sister ships for well-known vessels. And there are associated plaques and ships, bells, and bits of aircraft in all sorts of town halls around the country.
You mentioned utility wear. I mean, going to utility wear, because it's not something I'd particularly heard of until I bought my first bought an apartment, and it had a bedside table, which was quickly pointed out by my mother that it was utility wear, and it had a stamp on it.
Oh yeah. It had the cheese. It would have the cheese, what they call the cheeses. It looks a bit like Pac-Man, doesn't it? CC41. But the idea was it would be supposedly, and I think it was, made to a good quality standard with the least amount of materials, if you see what I mean. The testimony to the quality of utility furniture, sofas, wardrobes, is that a lot of it was, I can certainly remember an awful lot of people that got married in World War II and were still together 40, 50 years later, sitting, using their utility furniture. And that was great stuff. The clothing, it was very basic, and it was very utilitarian in some of the early designs. So they tried to zazz it up a bit by making it very colourful. That didn't always go down very well, so a lot of people took to sort of restyling, and it was also cheaper. It didn't impact too much on your coupons, and you could restyle your old clothes to kind of keep in style with the fashion, with a few suitable and sensibly bought accessories.
Accessorize.
Well, they never rationed makeup. It became very hard to get, but they never rationed it because they thought it would be bad for morale. Same for soap. Don't ration soap, otherwise your workforce will stink.
So, and if you look at the design, because it's the other thing about utility wear, it seems, am I right in saying it's quite, there's a sort of a modernity to it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it does look very much ahead of its time, but it's like the battle dresses. You won't have the pleats. You'll not be allowed your turn-ups. But in style, I mean, you've got creative minds like Norman Hartnell, who's kind of one of the founders of modern fashion. His fashion has second to none. So he's part of the team of utility clothing designers. So whereas men may have looked rather plain, but let's face it, men's fashion, the days of the macaroni are gone, but the ladies want to look great. So it was all about doing the best type of style that you could. And this is why when I say to folks at 40s events, have you darned your stockings? And they've got all these new ones. And you think, it'd be nice to see a few more darned stockings out there, because it would be far more patriotic to wear a darned one than keep using your new stuff.
Because the other it's not really a fashion accessory, but it's eponymous to the civilian life, is the gas mask. And millions of these produced. How quickly? I mean, when do they start producing the gas mask? Do they, does the war start and we have to panic build them, or are they stored, or how come everybody has a gas mask so fast, or seemingly, or is that a media construct?
Well, it's not a media construct. That's one thing. Once the world had seen the bombing of Guernica, there were enough voices in enough governments to say this is going to get nasty. And many people had remembered the horrors of gas warfare from World War I. So it didn't take much imagination to imagine that you're not going to just drop high explosive bombs or incendiary bombs. They could drop a gas bomb or use a gas spray. That's often forgotten. It could be sprayed out of the back of bombers too. So the drive for air raid precautions in Britain really began seriously with the Air Raid Precautions Act in 1935. Between 36 and 37, you end up with the creation of a special government department. The patent had already been created for the civilian gas mask at Portland Down. And so when you get to late 36, 37, they'd taken over a huge former weaving factory and a weaving mill. And it was completely dedicated to the filling of gas masks with get their filters filled. But we also had the advantage of having a number of rubber companies like Avon Tires, for example, Firestone, and Sieb Gorman that had produced resuscitation gear for years. So they'd also had sidelines producing things like bath mats or swimming hats. So when it comes to making these rubber face pieces, they could make the rubber face pieces. Another factory makes the eyepieces. The filling factory fills the filters. So when the gas masks are sent out for the first time, and the first gas masks were issued to the British people in September 1938. So we were ready by then. They'd produced millions of them. Because in 1938, of course, you got the Munich crisis. So by the time Chamberlain gets back and he holds aloft his piece of paper saying, "We have peace in our time," every household had got that little booklet you've probably seen, The Protection of Your Home Against Air Raids. Told you about safe rooms, and everybody got a gas mask. Now, that they didn't come complete. This was down to a local area, say your local village hall, town hall, parish hall. They would get together local WI, WVS, just local women that want to volunteer, often under the local vicar and an ARP chap. And they would be there, and they'd have the filters in one box, the band in the other, and the face piece in the other. And they would make the gas masks in a little local production line. And then people would either go to the ARP depots, or the gas masks would be taken round in some instances to people's homes, and they'd be fitted.
That's fascinating, because I forgot what's the survey, the listening survey that they do. It's gone right out of my head. Mass observation. So the mass observation sort of states the country's not really wanting to go to war in 39 and possibly even 40. They're still kind of a bit unsure. Well, it's probably because since 38 they've had the pants scared off them, because they've been told that the bomber always gets through and here's the gas mask because it might be here tomorrow, kind of thing.
That goes right back to the mid-30s. It really does. It really does. When
you're handing out gas masks, it's very real that it could be here.
It is. And the thing was, after Munich in 38, and when Chamberlain comes home, of course, there's a lot of critique, did he sell out to Hitler? And there's all these arguments. But the point is, no matter what the plan was, he bought us time. And in fact, so much time that some areas were collecting their gas masks in and thinking about, where are we going to store all these when the winds of war start blowing again, and August 39, and the gas masks are issued out there again. So that's why when children are going to be evacuated, there they all are with their little cardboard gas masks on.
Their little gas masks.
Little gas mask boxes.
You see them every photograph of the gas mask. It's just your eye almost slides over them because they're just there.
That's right, and we take it for granted, don't we? But that's why industry is so important in this war. People in so many World War II history books, there might be a nod to industry. But let's face it, if you hadn't got British industry, and we've talked about all sorts of things, but not forgetting those making munitions, making the weaponry, making the uniforms, making the equipment that the soldiers were carrying, the armoured fighting vehicles, the tanks. If you haven't got industry making that, you can't fight to defend this country. You can't hope to pursue a war to beat Nazi Germany if you ain't got the kit to do it.
Yeah, and I have to say, in popular histories, it's a corner of the war that gets very much overlooked, and it's a corner of the war that people probably think is quite boring, but actually there's so much going on. It's like light bulb moments going off when you look at that kind of thing. And
so many organised. I mean, for example, if you were a railway goods and wagons shop, right? These are absolutely vast places like the Derby Carriage and Wagon Works on the LMS. That gets turned over into a massive production of military vehicles. And they weren't alone. Things, they have to get the new equipment in, then new calibrations and all sorts. But when they're up and running, there was absolutely no stopping them. I love stories of things like, the webbing that soldiers wear, right? This 37-pound web. Well, you've got to get that made as well. Now, okay, you've got the big web producers, but they are putting their subcontractions out to a host of different companies. And they could be, if you think, I've got a nice bit of webbing here, bit of Mills equipment, yeah, it's marked MHG. You feel all butch, say, hey, I've got a great piece of kit here. Yeah, MHG is May Harris gowns, yeah, for the discerning woman, yeah, looking good. Or you could have TTG, which is the Teddy Toy Company. And Singer Sewing Machines, they're making the new spike bayonets for the number 4 rifle.
Now, if you told me they were making, I don't know, fans for demisters on planes, I'd go, okay, I can see that, Singer Sewing Machine, small components, but, knives for stabbing, I would have thought that'd be coming out some specialist forge in Sheffield or somewhere.
Sheffield, of course, they were places like Sanderson's and all the main makers, and Wilkinson Sword down in Sheffield. They were experts in making the long bladed bayonets that were familiar from the First World War and used in the early war years. And of course, a lot of them got shipped out with the old SMLEs out to the Burma War. But when you've got to be in the number 4, the spikies, that's very much Singer. There were subcontractors as well, not just in Britain as well, in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. But everybody had to pull together. Everybody had to do their bit. And if you're running munitions factories, yes, you'd think ICI. Well, ICI had their own, and you get government filling factories as well. But you also get subcontractors that know how to manage big factories producing ammunition, which included Joe Lyons. Now, the Lyons Corner House fame,
yes,
they're managing a munition factory.
But no, I've not quite got understood munitions factories. So the Royal Ordnance produce munitions? But are other people producing the parts and the casings for the munitions, and the Royal Ordnance just put it together? Well,
in the main, the Royal Ordnance factories are what they call filling factories. In the First World War, the stuff got known as the devil's porridge. So this is your cordite, this is your filling for your high explosive shells, etc. So, and the same went for hand grenades, that they would have to be filled. But when you've got the hand grenade case, shell casings, fuse casings, they can all be made by exterior contractors, engineering companies. But here's a little aside that maybe some of the listeners won't know. The term munitions. Now, in the First World War, you could work on munitions throughout the whole war and you would never touch a gun shell, let alone the devil's porridge, because a munition is anything that can pursue the war, feed the guns, so to speak. But munitions could be working on things like wings for aircraft, so you're working the whole war in maybe in what they call the dope shop, because you dope up the canvas coverings on the aircraft wings. You could be working in a carpenter's shop. You could be in a rope works, weaving hemp ropes up so that they could go on to become the handles of ammunition boxes, for example. That everything like that, right up to making a Sten gun, machine guns, rifles, whatever you want, they are all munitions.
I never thought of it that way. You do just think of it as being handling the physical ammunition, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's all industry at war.
Neil, I've really enjoyed that. We should do it again sometime.
Angus, a pleasure, my friend. A pleasure.
The home front is it's often overlooked, and it is fascinating. So, loyal listener, if you want to know more about British manufacturing and how the country rose to face the challenges, Neil's book is Wartime Industry. Even though I seem to have a rough schedule running almost through to Christmas. I'm still not sure next if we'll be looking at the Russian Night Witches or the American General Marshall and Henry Stimson. Please don't forget, if you have enjoyed the podcast, why not consider becoming a patron? You can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. $1 or so each month from listeners like yourself really does help me find the time to put the show together. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, I think that's all from me for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.